Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for this privilege of addressing you, but more so addressing a very pressing issue in aviation, specifically resulting in aircraft accidents, and this being loss of control in flight, or lock-eye. Before we start, and perhaps just a philosophical motto, aviation is essentially not about flying, but it's fundamentally about landing. And as cheesy as that might sound, you'll realize that that is the truth of what we're busy with every day. What we're going to do today is have a quick look at loss of control, specifically in flight, but also in life. We're going to look at a definition and scenario. We're going to look at some concepts being spatial orientation, loss of visual reference, control loci, situational awareness, a very important one, a different philosophy on safety being safety 1 versus safety 2, threat and error management, aeronautical decision making, and then a clinical assessment, and we'll look at the impact and takeaways of what we've been busy with today. I thought of throwing this in. We always see the romantic side of flying, the beauty of flying, the Tom Cruise Mavericks days of flying. But what does it look like when it goes wrong? If you have a look at that first picture, that is a beautiful AS-350 Squirrel helicopter. And a day later, we see the antithesis, a scene of disaster, calamity, the aircraft destroyed, and one person died on the actual scene. You'll notice there's a lot of foam, there's mayhem, there's pandemonium, and obviously the heartache of losing someone on the ground. This was through the loss of control. The pilot lost control of the actual aircraft, and to that extent it ended up in an absolute disaster. If we look at slide 2, a very familiar Robinson R-44 helicopter, again in pristine condition in front of the hangars. And the second slide shows us exactly what it doesn't look like, what we don't want it to look like. Literally a day later, that same helicopter in a pile of spares in full view of patrons at Rand Airport at the Harvard Cafe. An absolute tragedy. 2 people died in a flame ball, and something no one wants to behold. The third slide is our Bell 407 scenario that we're going to be looking at today, and the CAA report is recorded under 7191 for you to read and obviously peruse afterwards. A beautiful Bell 407 in all its glory, and the 3 smaller slides below show us the calamity again and the disaster that followed after this helicopter hitting the ground at 45 degrees nose down and virtually nothing left of it, including 2 lives that were lost of the owner and the corporate pilot. What is the definition of locus of control, or the loss of control in flight? An unexpected loss of visibility and ultimately control of the helicopter through external orientation aspects. What does that mean? A dark night, bad weather, or just loss of control through another means? If we look at the scenario, this Bell 407 accident in front of us, this happened on the 28th of April in the year 2000 on a farm located 10 nautical miles north of Beaufort West. The pilot and the 1 passenger departed in darkness on just after 6 in the morning and took off to fetch a family member, obviously with a high expectancy in Oudtshoorn. The weather was fine and was forecast to have a few fog patches in the area. And when one looks at the temperature, the dew point temperature versus the actual outside air temperature, there was no split. It was both at 3 degrees, meaning that the likelihood of fog was pretty great. The helicopter was overdue on its ETA, and the family started getting worried. They phoned around, but to no avail. No contact was made. And more or less 10:30 local time, more or less 4 hours after the takeoff, they found the helicopter 400 meters from the homestead. So it didn't even happen far from where they took off. Aboard was a well-known and well-renowned, internationally known eye surgeon. He was the owner of the helicopter. And he was flying with his company pilot, a seasoned CPL with a night rating. And this guy had just short of 2,000 hours, of which 730 had been in the last 12 months. So he was proficient and current, and by no means behind the curve. Why would this happen? Why would the helicopter end off in a pile of spares on a dark farm? The probable causes noted by the CIA report showed either spatial disorientation, vertigo, or loss of visual reference to the ground, the so-called black hole effect. Just one more picture of this absolute sadness and the tragedy that followed and the destruction that this helicopter left behind, more so the loss of life. Let's look at the factors that were highlighted by the CIA report. Firstly, spatial orientation and a short definition thereof. This is the pilot's ability to constantly discern and integrate his position in space relative to other aircraft, geographical landforms, weather and airspace. I've noted the antithesis there as well. What if you don't have all these conditions? It ends up in spatial disorientation. That's all external factors. In terms of an internal orientation aspects, inside the cockpit, what do we have? It's the location and layout of engine and flight instruments, switches and avionics, the amenities, lighting and control functions of our aircraft. The so-called saying of "I'm behind the aircraft." Automation nowadays is a major contributor to this. We're now going to have a look at a short video on spatial disorientation, the onset thereof, and again, the nasty outcome.
The moment an aircraft flies into the clouds, pilots no longer have any outside visual references that can give them a sense of direction. Because of that, they may have the feeling that the aircraft is flying horizontally, while in reality it is banked and making a turn. This feeling is called spatial disorientation, and it can be a contributory factor in serious aircraft accidents. Spatial disorientation is an overpowering feeling, one that a pilot can only overcome by systematically checking the flight instruments. But if a pilot is distracted from the instruments and he guides the aircraft by his senses, sensory illusions possibly form a serious threat. That's because in flight, the organs of balance give the pilot misleading information about the aircraft motion and orientation. Boeing and TNO have now developed a tool which can analyze and visualize the dangers of spatial disorientation. SDIT compares the actual movements of the aircraft with the calculated perception by the organ of balance and creates a visual representation of the differences. SDIT enables accident investigators to analyze recordings of the aircraft movements prior to and during aviation accidents in a better way. In the future, the tool could even prevent accidents by operating real-time in aircrafts and warn pilots when a risk of spatial disorientation is being detected. At the moment, TNO is working within the Aeolus Human Performance Innovation Program with Boeing and other parties in order to expand the model to visual illusions, which will make the tool suitable for helicopter operations in situations with reduced visibility.
Our second video shows what the loss of visual reference look like. More often than not, we think of that as only flying into instrument meteorological conditions. But a very dark night has exactly the same effect on our senses. And the lack of visual reference typically ends up in tears. This video clearly shows the issues surrounding IMC and where the pilot and the passengers found themselves.
Confusion appears to be the cause behind the deadly Mount Disappointment helicopter crash which killed 5 people in March. Investigators have released their first findings and now the victims' families want change to save others from the grief they're still feeling. Here's Adam Hegarty.
For the families, for a brother, no closure brings them back.
We're all struggling with it, really. I still don't understand the decisions that were made on the day.
At least, though, an explanation as to what caused the deaths of pilot Dean Neal and passengers Nicholas Vasudeva, Paul Troja, Ian Perry and Andrew's sister, Linda Woodford. Thick cloud that should have been avoided.
That is flying using visual references rather than instruments.
The doomed chopper was flying 3 kilometres behind another. The first pilot noticed a wall of cloud merging and broadcast on the radio, U-turn, U-turn, U-turn. But as the first chopper turned, Dean's helicopter went ahead beneath them into the cloud. It then turned left and down before hitting a tree trunk, plummeting to the ground.
It was probably descending to try to get below the cloud up top, but obviously the cloud was already on the bottom.
The other pilot suspects the respected Dean was confused by the U-turn warning. He'd replied saying, "Aren't we going to cut through?"
I'm not sure why, and I don't think we'll probably ever find out why.
No defects were found, so microflight helicopters stay in the sky. But the investigation is not over. Next, they'll be trying to download vision and audio from the crashed helicopter's camera. And no doubt, it'll be a harrowing watch.
Lessons can be learned. Once again, being cautious as the place to be when flying, so that no other family has to go through what we have.
Adam Hegarty, 9 News.
Those two videos show the harrowing side of when it goes wrong and the destruction that follows. If we come back to the control or the loss of control, we've been looking at a flight scenario only, but what does it look like in our lives? Is it only involved with flying and through our entire existence? If we look at the term volition in a life scenario, this is one's own, using your own will to do things, to execute. And there are two distinct facets that we look at. The first one is an internal locus of control. In that sense, we assert and retain control of situations. So we make it our own. We assume responsibility and accountability. There's also an external locus of control function, which is typically attributed to luck and or other person. So someone in this position or with this volition will never take responsibility of his situation. It's always someone else's problem. I don't have luck. I never have opportunities, which is hardly ever the case. What does situational awareness mean? If we look at this slide, that looks pretty impressive. A BO-105 helicopter upside down abeam the Statue of Liberty. And that takes the continuous cognitive and physical management of very complex variables, as you will agree, in that specific maneuver. Now, can that be taught or learned? And the simple answer is no. However, it can be gauged. And there are 4 measurable elements to accurately evaluate this situational awareness. The first one being your performance. That can be evaluated externally by your peers, by an instructor, by an examiner. That is also always done through subjective ratings. So very often an instructor would have an opinion as to your conduct and also your situational awareness with whatever you're busy with, in our case specifically flying. We can also do this through simulation, in a simulator, in scenarios where we need specific outcomes or expect specific outcomes or not. And then physiological factors. Can I physically handle this? In this case, you can clearly see that the pilot can handle it. He's obviously very capable, proficient in what he's doing, and he's got all faith in himself and the machine. A different philosophy to what we're used to in our existence and perhaps in our aviation careers, and that is the safety 1 philosophy versus the safety 2 philosophy, which was devised by Professor Erik Nolnagel from Norway more or less 10 years ago. And this makes for fascinating reading and something that I really cherish and like. Our normal day and our existence, particularly aviation, pivots around safety events. At times we focus on that only. So we have days and days and years perhaps of no safety issues. However, when there's an incident, an accident, even a hazard, the focus becomes that. And the left-hand side of that curve in the screen shows that. That's the safety 1 focus. Our lives are programmed to focus on what has gone wrong. However, safety 2 philosophy looks at what is going right. What are we doing right every day by virtue of just being here, of having arrived safely at our destination, of having lived through another day? Surely we've done something right, and that's exactly what safety 2 proposes. It's quite difficult to judge because it goes well. The causality functions are quite difficult as well to gauge. However, safety 1 is fairly easy because it's an outlier. You can see on both sides of the scale with the so-called tails of probability. When we get to a problem, we tend to pinpoint that very quickly so that we don't do the same or don't fall into the same trap again. Whereas safety 2 looks at what we're doing well and improving on that every day. If we look at threat and error management, holding hands to what we've just discussed, and specifically towards helicopters, we look at threats which are typically external and beyond our control. Examples for helicopter pilots, and I'm sure you're well aware of that, would be weather, power lines, high density altitudes, mountain flying, turbulence, the ones we've had a look at now, inadvertent IMC, and specifically on dark nights. What would the errors then be that we find ourselves challenged with? In this case, it'll be pilot or crew-based decisions, or perhaps the lack thereof, that leads us up a rabbit hole and ends up in tears. And the crew's actions in executing these decisions that we've made. The abbreviation below that is ADM, or Aeronautical Decision Making. So we've had a threat, we've perhaps had an error or not, but how do we base our decisions on more respectable data? In this case, a distinct knowledge of SOPs and applicable legislation. What does the law say? What does our company operations say? What does my own ethos say? Assertiveness. If I've made this decision, am I pushing through at all costs, Or am I reassessing as I go along? Which leads me to the third point there, the continuous assessment of a situation. So once a decision is made, an ADM decision, do I just stick to that or do I constantly assess that? So there's a feedback loop to constantly improve my precarious or safe situation. If we have a look at a critical assessment of what we've discussed today, and just briefly so, by looking at the scenario that we've seen earlier, what could the accident pilot or the owner have done differently? There was obviously psychological pressure to pick up the passenger at a specific time, almost regardless of what the weather looks like. I think that would have been a poor call, and it ultimately ended up with a calamity. And then if you were the pilot at home, where we're sitting now in the comfort of our homes, would you have acted the same in the same situation, or perhaps differently? And then accidents with similar causes and contributing factors. We showed but 3 pictures here of beautiful aircraft, and a day or 3 later, a pile of spares. How do we change that? What would be the difference? The impact and takeaways, hopefully after today's presentation for you all, would be an improved safety culture. And I've made 3 notes there. In South Africa specifically, we come from an exceptionally lawless and ill-disciplined background, whether it's on the roads, whether it's on your boat on the water, whether it's at home. And we need to improve that through a personal improvement of safety culture, then an aviation safety culture, and then a national safety culture, so that we embody all of this in our existence and not only limit it to our aviation exposure. We need greater situational awareness. Again, whether you're driving, whether you're flying, whether you're on your boat. Hand in hand with that would be preparation, the planning and prediction towards better decision making. Back to our safety 2 graph again. How do we predict things that might go wrong when we're looking at things that constantly go right? We're hoping for better airmanship and assertiveness. Ultimately, we want to see a reduction in general aviation accident rates. What hit home for you in integrating what we did today? We've had situational awareness issues. We've looked at scenarios where aircraft end up in ground or being burnt out, with the pilots having lost control in flight. I'll share with you how this hit me. This accident, the specific Bell 407 accident, happened on my birthday in the year 2000, and that helicopter was operated by my company. I said goodbye to the 2 pilots the afternoon before as they left for Beaufort West, only to be called up the next morning around 11 to inform me that the helicopter is no more, and obviously 2 lives. It had a profound effect on me, having seen that helicopter and the 2 guys literally 15 hours before, and the outcome you saw for yourselves. I thank you for your time today. I hope by virtue of seeing this has created an awareness of what we are busy with, the inherent risks we've got to manage, how situational awareness and spatial disorientation can jump on your back and be a potential killer. I thank you.